The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has taken on the monumentous task of fighting corruption globally. Corruption is a great enabler of organized crime and drug trafficking and is a serious impediment to the effective rule of law and sustainable development. The high levels of corruption throughout some of the developing world has allowed countries to fail rather than to thrive. It has this effect by reallocating money. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that globally, $40 billion in US dollars is lost due to corruption on an annual basis. This loss has effects on institutions which would benefit from the financing, such as healthcare systems, the education systems, and economic institutions. It also widens the divide in many instances between the common citizens and those partaking in corrupt activities, such as the drug traffickers and politicians who benefit from the system. It also furthers mistrust in the common citizen's faith and the ability for good governance. One of the most important issues with corruption globally is that although it benefits those involved, it does not distribute benefits nationally, and it is adversely affecting the poorer and developing countries by taking money from infrastructure needed for national development and instead putting it into the pockets of the few. This reinforces the need for drug trafficking by perpetuating poverty conditions, and the poverty conditions perpetuate corruption. It is a cyclical system that is often difficult or impossible for individual nations to remedy themselves, because due to the uneven distribution of wealth, those involved with corruption can have more powerful networks than those seen to hold the power in the nation. This is not standard for all nations, though, as there are varying degrees of corruption seen globally. The most dangerous of these is the high level of corruption. This includes corruption by high-level officials as well as judicial members. This poses the greatest threat to the state, as corruption at this magnitude can be far-reaching and can also have significant influence on the outcomes of democratic processes. Examples of this can be seen in Italy through Mexican drug cartels as well as international drug traffickers in Guinea-Bissau, among others. Another level of corruption, which is less threatening on a global or national level, but should be taken seriously nonetheless, is the low level of corruption. This generally involves local level politicians and is seen across the European Union, among other places. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime takes the issue of corruption very seriously and has collectively issued multiple conventions in an effort to stop or slow corruption globally, because corrupt institutions can only be challenged with a collective will to do so. These include the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which was adopted on November 15, 2000 and entered into force on September 29, 2003. This includes 147 signatories, and 188 states are a party as of July of 2017. Although this has succeeded in slowing corruption, the real initiative targeting corruption is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. This is currently the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument. This was adopted in 2003 and entered into force on December 14, 2005. It currently has 140 signatories, as well as 183 nations are a party. The effect of this is to allow international influence over 5 main areas of adherence. These include preventative measures, criminalization and law enforcement, international cooperation, asset recovery, and technical assistance and information exchange. This also covers different forms of corruption, which include bribery, trading in influence, abuse of functions, as well as various acts of corruption within the private sector. As of 2017, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is working with other agencies to expand their reach to tackle corruption in wildlife crime, sports, and violent extremism, in addition to the 5 main areas currently covered under the convention.
Drug trafficking is the global phenomenon involving the movement of illicit narcotics, precursor chemicals, and weapons. This process entails a great deal of corruption, violent crime, ecological destruction, and a high cost to society. The UNODC maintains statistics on drug trafficking and aids in the development and implementation of various programs, treaties, and commissions aimed at ebbing the flow of narcotics on a global scale. The cost of drug trafficking to the global community is high. The UNODC estimates that nearly 1% of the global trade market is directly related to the illicit drug trade, being the equivalent to 321.6 billion US dollars. Due to the massive potential for profits, drug organizations are willing to engage in violence, corruption, and ecological destruction. This leaves societies to pay for the increased healthcare cost associated with drug use and violence, increases in law enforcement budgets, economic damage from lost productivity, and cleanup, both ecological and urban. This puts a huge strain on developing nations who simply cannot afford all the added expense. The UNODC and the global community work tirelessly to combat drug trafficking. The UNODC follows the three major drug-related treaties, including the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, amended 72, the Convention on Psychotropic Substances of 1971, and the UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotics and Psychotropic Substances of 1988. The goal of these treaties is to ensure uniformity in control measures, which ensures both a steady supply of essential pharmaceuticals and prevents precursor chemicals and illicit drugs from being trafficked and distributed. The UNODC also oversees the Paris Pact. This is a group of 58 partner countries and 23 organizations aimed at combating illicit opiate trade and trafficking originating from Afghanistan. This is done by implementing regional initiatives, detecting and blocking financial flows, preventing precursor chemicals from entering illicit markets, and reducing drug abuse and dependence. The UNODC oversees various programs tailored to the nuance of the drug trafficking problem with respect to Africa, Asia, the Americas, the Middle East, and Europe. Examples of these include the Triangular Initiative, the Container Control Program, and the Country Program for Pakistan.
Hello everyone, my name is Chad Guthrie, and I would like to discuss CrimeJust as a UNODC project, the problems CrimeJust is trying to address, along with the importance of the program and the solution that needs to be met for this project to be successful with the elimination of the illegal drug trade, mostly along the cocaine routes. This statement, taken directly from the CrimeJust site, outlines the overall mission of the project. The transnational nature of drug trafficking, as well as the increasing multi-crime portfolio of organized crime groups, creates a challenge to member states and underlines the necessity for an equally horizontal approach to cooperation at a national, regional, and interregional level. The criminal drug activities across Latin America and the Caribbean and West Africa have increased, with many of these criminal organizations cooperating together. Next, I would like to discuss the importance of CrimeJust and some of the treaties it represents. CrimeJust is a criminal justice program funded by the EU and supported by Interpol and Transparency International. This program is designed to advise, train, and help regulate the cocaine routes through these specific regions with support from the international community to help fight the organized crime and the illicit drug trade market. CrimeJust's main objectives are to help these countries fight the corruption, the organized crime which transports the drugs. It also aims at supporting these nations with the proper guidance on law enforcement and the judiciary process needed to investigate and prosecute the organizational members involved. These three treaties are conventions agreed upon by the supporting nations and the United Nations in an effort to regulate and mitigate illegal drug sales and trafficking internationally. First is the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs from 1961. This convention was designed to fight drug abuse through a unilateral collaboration within the international community. The convention works under two basic concepts. One is limit the aspects of drugs exclusively to medical and scientific purposes. Second, it fights drug trafficking through international cooperation to prevent and discourage drug traffickers. Second is the Convention on Psychotropic Substances from 1971. According to the UNODC, on the Resource on Treaties, this convention establishes an international control system for psychotropic substances. It responded to the diversification and expansion of the spectrum of drugs of abuse and introduced controls over a number of synthetic drugs according to their abuse potential on the one hand and their therapeutic value on the other. Last is the United Nations Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances from 1988. This convention under the United Nations provides the objectives for the international community with regards to procedures against drug trafficking and the illegal activities associated with trafficking. It is also a guideline for states to cooperate with the international community in the extradition of drug traffickers, controlled deliveries, and transfer of proceedings. This statement explains the overall project of CrimeJust under the UNODC and its future goals under the UN Agenda, Goal 16. Under this project, UNODC aims to synergize efforts to bridge gaps to strengthen criminal investigations and criminal justice cooperation, as well as institutional integrity and accountability along the cocaine routes in Latin America and the Caribbean and West Africa. This will actively contribute to a regional response to address organized crime and drug trafficking, while also assisting member states towards the future development of the global goals. For the CrimeJust solutions to work, certain aspects must be met and upheld. All member states need to be held accountable for their actions and indirect support of the drug trade. CrimeJust lays out three main objectives that need to be met for the project to be successful. If these three main objectives are followed, it would minimize the trade along these routes. These next objectives are directly from the project requirements for CrimeJust. Capacity building. This is where crime justice wants to strengthen the capacities of the criminal justice institutions, that would include law enforcement and the judiciary system, to detect, investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate drug trafficking and related organized crime cases. Next is the interregional cooperation. This covers fostering regional and interregional cooperation between criminal justice institutions, law enforcement, and the judiciary by promoting good practices, information exchange, networking, and a South-to-South cooperation. Also, institutional integrity. This is enhancing the institutional integrity and accountability of criminal justice institutions as a way to reinforce mutual trust and confidence within and between both regions, with the active involvement of civil society organizations. Thank you for your time, and I hope this portion of the presentation gives you an insight to how the UNODC is battling the drug trade and all aspects related to the drug trade.
Demand for illicit drugs creates a market for organized crime to cultivate and traffic product. The drug trade provides organized crime groups an estimated $322 billion per year. In developing nations, income like this often allows these groups to undermine authority and create or contribute to corruption. This can lead to distrust of government by its people, tension within government, and can significantly reduce developmental progress. Some examples of organized crime groups that have used drug trafficking as a primary source of income include cartels like the Medellin cartel that was prevalent in Colombia during the 1970s into the 1990s. Current organizations include Russian mafia groups who often traffic drugs from countries like Afghanistan. One of the largest known gangs in the world is the Yamaguchi-gumi in Japan, who in 2014 had revenue over $6.6 billion, the majority of which came from the illegal drug trade. Organized crime plays a major role between drug trafficking and political turbulence around the world. Victimization and erosion of social and human capital can severely degrade quality of life, especially in developing countries. Organized crime can limit opportunities of education and employment, as well as the ability to increase assets. Additionally, a heavy presence of organized crime signals social instability to foreign investors, which can hinder economic growth. Many developing countries rely on tourism as a crucial source of income. Unfortunately, drug and organized crime often push tourists away. Organized crime often contributes to corruption within governments and justice systems, which degrades the faith and trust people have in their governments and leaders. While the ultimate goal is to completely wipe out the illegal drug trade, any steps to lessen its reach will negatively impact organized crime by constricting income. Reducing the resources for gangs and cartels around the world will create positive change in political turbulence, especially in developing countries. Additionally, fighting organized crime in other ways will help to minimize drug trafficking by reducing their abilities to contribute to the illicit trade. The following are some contributors to the solution of drug trafficking and organized crime. International Conventions on Drug Control. This convention recognizes the urgent attention needed to ending the illicit drug trade. Over 106 different countries participated in outlining the necessities of ending the drug trade, the importance of cooperation, and the determination of depriving those involved in the illicit trafficking and their proceeds from it. The UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Because organized crime often crosses national borders, it requires the ability for law enforcement to cross borders. If there isn't cohesion in effort and criminal justice standards, the fight against organized crime will lose. This convention promotes cooperation between countries to create a more efficient and cohesive force against organized crime. The UN Convention Against Corruption. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, the UN Convention Against Corruption is the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument. Because organized crime directly contributes to corruption throughout the world, it is crucial for an international effort in law enforcement and preventative measures if we are to see an end in corruption.